Our first speaker is going to be Mr. John Medaille from Texas, who is both a businessman and an educator at Texas University of Dallas. And he's just written a book, which there are flyers for at the back, and I'd encourage you strongly to get a copy of it. I have one, and it looks just fascinating. His topic is Usury, Wealth Without Work, Why It Matters. Please welcome Mr. John Medaille.
Thank you, Stephen. You're an amazingly patient group of people. Unfortunately, I'm a theologian rather than a preacher, so preachers are more interesting than theologians, but I hope I can keep you interested anyway. And the great problem a theologian has in discussing usury is that economists regard it as a moral term and therefore exclude it from scientific discourse. In this view, ethics and economics occupy separate ontological realms, and between the two worlds, there can be no real connection or communication. To them, it is positive science that remains the master discourse, the true and only description of reality, while ethics occupies the shadowy world of what ought to be. The question, as economists see it, is one of science. They are happy to wear the mantle of positive science and leave the normative talk to priests, shamans, and scholastics, or whoever else wants the job, just so long as the shamans will leave them alone. The problem with this view is that it is not scientific. To be precise, the very distinction between a normative and positive science betrays a misunderstanding of the scientific enterprise in general and the work of economists in particular. For clearly, economics is a humane science, dependent on the other humane sciences for the very definition of its starting terms. To cast off the humane sciences is to abandon any possibility of being scientific. In this paper, I will attempt three tasks. The first is to explicate the relationship between normative and positive science and to annihilate the differences between them. The second task is to show the relationship between ethics and economics, or more precisely, between equity and equilibrium. And the third task is to show how usury destroys equity and therefore makes equilibrium impossible. But more importantly, I will attempt to demonstrate that there can be no real quarrel between the moral order and the economic order. To posit such a quarrel merely means that one has either misunderstood ethics or misunderstood economics. Is economics a positive science? Let me suggest that this question is meaningless. Every science, insofar as it really is a science, is both positive and normative. Every science, insofar as it is a science, must be normalized to some criteria of truth. These criteria will arise from two sources: internal and external. The internal criteria involve the science's proper subject matter and methodology. But such internal criteria are insufficient to found any science as a science. In addition, there must be an external criteria of truth. And this external criteria can only come from one or more of the higher sciences. In the absence of such an external check, the science will merely be circular, dependent upon nothing but itself, and unconnected with the hierarchy of truth. Thus, for example, biology is responsible to chemistry, chemistry is responsible to physics, and physics to mathematics and metaphysics. No biologist can violate the laws of chemistry, and no chemist can reach a conclusion contrary to physics. Thus, every science is responsible to its own methodology, and therefore positive, and to the higher sciences, and therefore normative. It is necessary then to determine what the higher sciences are for economics. Now, the physical sciences terminate physics, but the humane sciences terminate in some view of anthropology, derived ultimately from philosophy and theology, with stops along the way for psychology and sociology. It would seem to be self-evident that a complete view of man would involve these sciences. Yet, this view is not generally accepted by economists. How is it possible that a humane science can cut itself off from these indispensable sources of knowledge about humans? The answer lies in the fact that the neoclassical and Austrian economists accept as a purely economic truth that which is in fact a purely philosophic stance, namely that of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. Mises's Human Action, for example, merely renames Bentham's hedonistic thesis as praxeology and claims that it has the same epistemological status as do logic and mathematics, quote, unconditionally valid for all beings endowed with the logical structure of the human mind, end quote. Nevertheless, some of us, clinging to our illogically structured minds, have sought another basis for the understanding of human relationships. And the basis that some of us seek are in Aristotle. That is, and in Aristotle's notion of justice. Because economics is in fact a set of human relationships. And for Aristotle, and for all the scholastics that followed in his wake, all human relationships are governed by the virtue of justice. And for Aristotle, justice is not just a part of virtue, it is virtue entire. And injustice is not just a part of vice, but vice entire. Aristotle discusses two kinds of justice, distributive and corrective. Distributive justice deals with how a science distributes its common goods. This refers to the common goods of a state, a firm, a partnership, or any cooperative enterprise. For Aristotle, these distributions are proportional to one's contribution. However, different contributions can be valued in different ways. For example, how does one measure the relative contribution to production of, say, the janitor and the engineer? For Aristotle, this was a cultural question. Quote, for Democrats identify it with the status of a freeman, supporters with oligarchy with wealth or noble birth, and supporters of aristocracy with excellence, end quote. Corrective justice, on the other hand, deals with justice in exchange. That is, with transactions between individuals. In this case, justice consists in exchanging equal values, in having an equal amount before and after the transaction. The problem is how to determine what values are equal when dealing with dissimilar products. To use Aristotle's example, how many pairs of shoes are equal to one house? The only way to know this was by need, or by the demand function, mediated by money. Thus, the demand for houses and shoes can be compared by looking at their prices, and the two can be equated in terms of money. Money, however, was itself a social convention. Quote, that is why it has the name money, nomisma, because it exists not by nature, but by law, nomos. Thus, the requirement for equality in exchange comes from the natural law, but the method of implementing it is legal or conventional. Now, it is important to note that distributive justice involves a theory of production, and corrective justice is a theory of exchange. And hence, these are two separate parts of a complete theory. Under distributive justice, what one gets is proportional to what one gives. One's wealth is related to one's work. The philosopher gives us the following model of an economy. The cobbler receives a certain number of shoes proportional to his contribution to production, while the carpenter receives a certain number of tables and chairs. This is distributive justice. Since neither one needs that many shoes or that many chairs, they then exchange between themselves to correct the imbalance. That's corrective justice. Of course, cobblers and carpenters are paid not with actual shoes and chairs, but with money. Nevertheless, the corrective and distributive principles remain the same. Now, up until the 15th century, this unity of distributive and corrective justice was recognized both implicitly and explicitly. Economics was essentially a virtuous enterprise. However, in the late 16th century, as new forms of ownership and production began to take hold, a more individualistic approach to economics gradually developed. The ethical framework of medieval economics came under attack, but there was little to replace it. Or rather, what sought to replace it was a new concept that preached quite openly that greed is good. This idea was most famously expressed in Bernard de Mandeville's The Fable of the Bees, subtitled Private Vices, Public Benefits. Mandeville put forth this seemingly strange paradox that the vices despised in the older moral code would result in the greatest public good. The locus of economics shifted from the virtuous to the vicious. And it is Mandeville and not Smith who is the true founder of modern economics. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith attempts to include both kinds of justice, but they are disconnected from each other. Smith's labor theory of value is about production, and it is inherently a theory of distributive justice. The invisible hand theory, on the other hand, is about exchanges, and hence is a theory of corrective justice. However, Smith could never join the two halves of his theory into a coherent whole, and hence it is no surprise that through the 19th century, economics bifurcates into two contending traditions, the labor theorists and the utilitarians. Neither side could offer a complete description of the economic situation, try as they might. This impasse was broken by the marginalist revolution, by which returns to labor and capital were, in theory, priced at their marginal contributions. Under this theory, commodity prices would be driven to cost of production and economic rent eliminated. The magic by which productivity and price were to be equated was free bargaining. Both worker and capitalist were free to accept or reject any contract offered. By this means, and over time, returns to both capital and labor would be normalized to each other. That is, there would not be great differences between wealth and poverty. Prices would be driven to costs, and economic rents eliminated. The economy would achieve equilibrium by a pure system of exchanges without recourse to distributive justice. Contractual, that is, corrective justice alone, could solve all economic problems. The messy cultural problems of distributive justice could be eliminated entirely and economics placed on a mathematical basis and therefore become a science. Now you still have to endure me. The problem with this theory, however, had already been pointed out by Adam Smith a century before the theory was advanced. Namely, contracts do not arbitrate productivity. Contracts arbitrate power. Most workers cannot withhold their labor for as much as a month, and few could hold out for a year. On the other hand, the masters, as Smith called them, could easily survive for years on their wealth without employing a single hand. Therefore, the capitalist will always have an inherent advantage over the worker, and the wage contract will reflect this advantage unless something is done to address the imbalance of power between them. That is to say, unless there is some prior institution of distributive justice, corrective justice will be insufficient to relate wages to productivity. There is one simple principle that must apply to any economic theory. In order for there to be economic equilibrium, what one takes out of the economy must be equivalent to what one puts in. That is to say, work and wealth must be equated. Under such conditions, equilibrium is a trivial problem. Absent such conditions, equilibrium is impossible. If there is not a general balance of supply and demand, if there is not a general expectation that markets can be cleared at a price sufficient to cover the cost of production, the economy grinds to a halt. Investors will not invest. Wages will be too low to clear the markets. Try as we might, we simply cannot get away from the Aristotelian requirement for distributive justice. The most obvious economic truth in the world is that if there is wealth without work, then there must also be work without wealth. If someone gets more than he gives, someone else must give more than he gets. It is quite true that no value theory can fix with precision the relative values of giving and getting. Yet, reasonable judgments may be made, and each theory provides a criterion for judgment, namely, that profit and wages are normalized to each other. This means, if there is a high degree of social inequality, then someone must be getting more than he gives, and the economy is out of balance. But no society can long tolerate such disequilibrium conditions. Lacking a principle of distributive justice, we must use non-economic means to balance the economy. The major non-economic means of restoring equilibrium are charity, welfare, and consumer credit, that is, usury. Each of these methods transfers purchasing power from one group, which presumably has an excess, to another, which has a deficit. The first method, charity, will always be necessary to some degree because no economic system can be perfect. With the second method, welfare and government spending, governments seek to reestablish equilibrium conditions by redistributing incomes or by increasing spending. And for a while, this method worked fairly well. However, in this system, distributive justice takes the less efficient form of a redistributive bureaucracy. But for some time now, government redistributions have been insufficient to balance the economy, and we have depended chiefly on the third method, usury. This is the plastic economy, an economy based on credit cards. And to the extent that an economy depends on consumer credit, it is quite literally a house of cards. And will be as unstable as those structures usually are. Of course, usury merely delays the problem, postpones the crisis to a future period. Clearly, a borrowed dollar used to increase demand today must decrease demand tomorrow by that same dollar, plus interest. This necessitates more borrowing, and eventually the system falls of its own weight as credit is extended to an increasingly weakened consumer, and a credit crisis results. The stability conferred on an economy by usury is illusory and temporary. Non-economic equilibrium provides us with a measure of just how well an economy is doing in economic terms. If the economy has a high dependence on non-economic means, we may assume that there are serious problems in the economy itself. We are now in a position to make a judgment about usury. The criterion for this judgment will be whether usury adds anything to the economy, or whether it is an example of wealth without work. If the former, then it is a proper part of economic order. If the latter, it destroys economic order. Note here that the moral judgment and the economic judgment are identical. And that's however one judges the case. There are not two separate ontological realms, but only one truth to which all sciences must relate. But before we can make our judgment on usury, a few comments on money are in order. Money is a marvelous thing. Money directs the operation of an economy. There can be land to work, hands to work it with, and tools with which to work it, but without money, these things will never get together, or will do so only in a very primitive manner. But although money is a marvelous thing, there is some dispute about just what kind of thing money is. For some, it is a commodity, for others, a store of value, and still others, a mere medium of exchange. Well, without going into any of these arguments, one thing we can say about money is that it is an accounting system. If, in doing a day's work, I add, say, $100 to the stock of goods and services available to the public, it is important that I get a credit for $100, credit which gives me the right to take an equal amount out of said stock of goods and services. This credit can be in the form of gold coins, little slips of paper, or electronic bits roaming around cyberspace. In the latter case, no currency of any kind is required, and there need never be any reason for me to convert my electronic credits into actual slips of paper or metallic coins. The computer money is independent of any particular physical representation. I do a day's work, and my account gets credited for that work. I go shopping, my account gets debited. The currency I carry, if I happen to carry any, is simply the credits in visible form. And in exchanging the visible credits for tangible goods, I surrender them and thereby debit my own account and credit the account of whomever I give the money to. Once we grasp money as an accounting system, we understand immediately why any medium will do. Why tally sticks work as well, if not better, than gold coins. The tally stick can be created whenever a new product is created, and can be marked whenever the product is sold over how long a period of time it takes to sell the product. One need not wait for the mint or the bank to supply one with the visible form of the credits. Either the tally stick or electronic bits can be supplied at virtually no cost. Money can be called into being simply by the production of saleable commodities. Further, this accounting system exactly matches a proper economy. Work adds both tangible wealth, real products and services, and the accounting wealth, money, necessary to circulate them. The question is then, does usury add a saleable product to the commodity, to the economy? Is usury necessary for the circulation of real wealth? Clearly, in order to produce something, we must consume other things. Labor, raw materials, tools. These things must be paid for, and paid for in proportion to what they contribute to production. If in order to produce something, I borrow any of these things, I must pay the owner a proportion of what is produced. If I borrow the money to pay for them, what I really borrow is the things themselves, the things that money stands for. To put it in concrete terms, if I lend a farmer a supply of seed corn to plant a crop, I have some claim on some portion of that crop. Likewise, if I lend him the money to buy the seed corn, I have exactly the same claim. The money merely stands for the actual seed corn, and the claim is identical. In such a case, there is no case of usury. But suppose there is no crop. Suppose that wind and weather combine to cause a crop failure. What claim do I have? None that I can see. Like the farmer, I took a risk. And like the farmer, I take a loss. The failure of the crop dissolves all claims. To demand a payment would be to take a share of what did not happen. I may demand the return of the property he borrowed, if that is possible, but I cannot demand the share of a profit that does not exist. Further, my claim stands on one more assumption, namely, that I actually have the money that I lent. If I did not have the funds, if, for some odd reason, the powers that be had given me the power to lend that which I did not have, any payments, whether for principal or interest, would be wealth without work. Of course, this is exactly what happens today, as you all know. Investors may claim a share of the output where there is output and where they actually have the money they invest. No society can advance economically without such investment. And since capital represents stored up labor, to deny such returns to capital would be to deny returns to the labor it represents. But to demand a return where there is none, or to demand more than is made, or to demand when nothing in reality was lent, is to guarantee that the economy will always be both inequitable and unstable. Such economies must constantly rely on government interventions to rebalance their accounts, and must suffer recurring bouts of contraction that no government can cure. Most religious traditions reject the notion of usury, but the sages of the Enlightenment, such as our friend Jeremy Bentham, rejected this teaching, mostly because it was a religious teaching. But by doing so, they wrote into their systems the very sources of economic rent, the formal term for wealth without work, that make equilibrium economically impossible. Hence, and despite the best of intentions, they must suffer a continual expansion of government power over an increasingly unstable economy, an expansion that must continue until collapse. And in place of a real science, we have only a series of contending ideologies masquerading as scientific truths. By declaring its independence from the hierarchy of truth, economics has declared itself independent of science itself and a slave to mere ideology. Only by subjecting itself to the sources of truth can economics claim the name of science, and only then can it give adequate guidance to those who would seek a more proper role for government or a better distribution of wealth. In social justice circles, there is an old saying: if you wish for peace, you must work for justice. The economic equivalent is, if you wish for equilibrium, you must work for equity. For equilibrium is economic peace, and equity is economic justice, and you will never see the one without the other. Thank you.